Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Vigilantism. It's a word that conjures images of lynch mobs and frontier justice. But is it now becoming the new normal in American politics? In fact, state governments are not just turning a blind eye to vigilantes, but actively encouraging them. Across America, vigilantism is being legalized at an alarming rate. Virginia sets up a tip line for parents to snitch on teachers. Texas unleashes bounty hunters against abortion providers. Florida encourages drivers to run over protesters, and states are even allowing random individuals to challenge voters. My guest, Jon Michaels, along with his co-author David Knoll, argues that we're witnessing nothing less than a concerted effort to subvert democracy through legalized vigilantism. Michaels sees a pattern, and it's one that should concern us all. In their new book, Vigilante Nation, Michaels and Knoll expose how networks of right-wing politicians, pundits, plutocrats, and preachers are deploying vigilantism to cement their hold on power and impose their reactionary morality on America at large. They argue that these developments represent a concerted post-January 6th legal and political strategy. Today we'll explore the historical roots of this phenomenon, from the Fugitive Slave Act's use of bounty hunters to Southern clans violently enforcing Jim Crow. The United States has a long, dark history of legal vigilantism, and now, as we face a presidential nominee who openly invites political violence, understanding the mechanisms and implications of these vigilante laws could not be more urgent. Jon Michaels is a professor of law at UCLA, specializing in constitutional and national security law. His award-winning scholarship has appeared in the law reviews of Yale, Harvard, and the University of Chicago. He's a Yale Law graduate and former Supreme Court clerk, and serves on the advisory board of UCLA's Safeguarding Democracy Project. It is my pleasure to welcome Jon Michaels to talk about Vigilante Nation, how state-sponsored terror threatens our democracy. Jon, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it is great to have you here. I want to talk first about January 6th and whether you think that January 6th, as you argue, really created fundamental change in the way we look at vigilantism today.
Well, I think it's an inflection point in the way that most people think about it as an inflection point. The ease with which a community mobilized to attack the literal and physical foundations of our democracy, the apologies, the defenses, the celebrations of it that carry on to this day really showed, I think, many of us that the kind of our violent and anti-democratic past is far from been mothballed. We never really went away, and it's surfacing again. The difference, I think, after January 6th is the recognition that chaos doesn't necessarily work, and that there's an opportunity, because there's public support for the type of belligerence and violence and anti-democratic movement, that if this could be marshaled and mobilized in a coherent fashion, it could be used as a tool of ordinary politics.
As you say, though, that there is this violent past, there is this history of vigilantism. Is this something that's been cyclical, and should we assume that the period that we're in now is just one of those times?
Well, I think we could think about it as cyclical, but if we think about America as a path on an upward trajectory, not like any other nation, where we evolve, we learn, we eschew what went wrong, and cling to with your life that which goes right and which is better. If we think of ourselves on an upward trajectory, that I think some of our leading states people of the various eras have encouraged us to do, then it doesn't represent a pendulum swinging back. It represents a major step backwards, of pulling us off that upward trajectory where we essentially in the 1960s turned our back on vigilantism in ways that I think folks were hoping was for good. But in fact, it has great comparisons, unfortunately, to the Jim Crow era, to the antebellum period. And so it's too soon to say whether and how quickly we're going to be able to swing back from this current period of of danger and true democratic peril.
What else is different about this period of vigilantism now? You talk about different kinds of vigilantism. I mentioned a few of the things that are going on politically in the introduction. What's different about the vigilantism of today?
Yeah, so if we think about you mentioned in your introductory remarks, which were quite generous, the notion of frontier justice. So let's start there, because I think that gives us the most to kind of work with analytically. In the period of time where we're settling the frontier, where there aren't a lot of people, let alone government infrastructure in many parts of the United States, things had to get done. Now, we don't necessarily like how they had to get done, but things had to get done with the help of just private citizens mobilizing to get things done. It didn't have to just be criminal justice or anything else. There just had to be a lot more private initiative, because the government couldn't and didn't reach a lot of places. So once the government expanded itself and once became a kind of a more modern, professionalized government, the need for private self-help went away. And I think a lot of people were relieved that period passed, because with the government, you have greater legal accountability, you have greater professional training, you have kind of less likely that it's going to be a personal vendetta and more likely going to be a dispassionate enforcement of justice. Now, of course, that doesn't always happen that way, but that's the idea, that's the notion, that's what we strive for. So the impetus for private violence went away, and we supplanted it with the government. Now, today, it's not as if the government has retreated in size. In fact, many of today's leading proponents of things like what David Knoll and I are calling state-sponsored vigilantism think the government is too big, think the government is too much in everyone's face. So they're not doing this in the various examples that you previewed in the introduction because no one else can do it. They're not the only tough guy in the town, like a Gary Cooper in High Noon or something like that. They're doing it for another reason. So that's our first step, is that if we want to be apologetic or defensive about past instances, we could say maybe the government wasn't available, but the government is available now. And I think that's the big marker of, and we're going to do this anyway. So it's the necessity is gone. The second point that parallels the past is it's a willingness and an eagerness or fear that motivates a certain group of individuals who have influence to decide to dominate another group, because they fear that other group, because that other group threatens them in some way, whether it's runaway slaves in the antebellum period who've gotten to the north. And sure, it's about collecting quote unquote property, but it's also about punishing those who dare to defy the system and dare to have a life, perhaps a calm and settled life, where they didn't have to look over their shoulders for the remaining years and months and days of their lives, and who dared to defy the system had to be punished. In the same way as we're seeing today, and we'll, I'm sure, discuss the examples, but whether it's a pregnant person seeking abortion, whether it's trans kids just hoping to play on a sports team that matches their gender identity, whether it's people looking to vote presumably in a way that doesn't satisfy the kind of belligerent communities in the South and Midwest today, we're seeing people who are essentially put back in their place. And for private individuals to put people back in their place rings differently. It feels differently. It feels, I hate to use the word authentic or organic, but it provides a different type of community empowerment and community terrorizing than if the state were to do those things in more kind of clinical fashion, that the inspectors came from the state capitol and went around and looked at books on the shelf to pull books off the shelf for book bans. Feels very different from a very popular PTA mom doing it.
Have the laws today made it easier for vigilantes?
Yeah, and that's the next thing that I'm glad we're touching upon. So the vigilantism in the United States that David and I kind of connect the current movement to is a particular type of vigilantism, which is state supported, either through express legal authority or very clear understanding that the authorities will not crack down on forms of political violence exercised by community leaders or self-appointed community watchdogs. What we saw in that period of time that I suggested when that type of vigilantism kind of fell out of favor in the 1960s and the 1970s, when we were repulsed by the excesses of Jim Crow, when there was no need anywhere in the United States for resorting to private organized violence because police forces and municipal government was everywhere. What we're seeing today is, unlike in that period of time, when people acted as a vigilante in the 1970s or the 1980s, they went to jail, they went to prison, they were condemned. You may remember, and some of your listeners may remember Bernard Goetz from the New York City subways in the 1980s. That was a kind of a moment of passion and enthusiasm for folks who were in some ways nostalgic for a system in which white men carried guns and put black youth in their place. But he was discredited and denounced and ultimately imprisoned for his action. And that's, again, where I thought, and David and I thought, kind of the world had settled, the United States world had settled. Yes, these folks exist. Yes, these folks are going to do danger. But the community in a bipartisan fashion is going to crack down on that type of excess. And what we're seeing now, and slowly but surely, and this is what David and I call part of the January 7th project. Okay, mobs taking over the Capitol don't work. The mobs that take over the Capitol will go to prison for 20 years. But if the states can create legal avenues for mob-like politics to resurface in America, they could cause a whole lot of problems. And they could help essentially terrorize communities so that red state MAGA politics can stay in charge for the foreseeable future, even though it's a dwindling political movement as a matter of ideology and a matter of demographics. So what David and I do is we trace all the different state legislative moves that allow essentially private enforcement of old school white supremacist, patriarchal, anti-LGBT, anti-inclusive curricular in school. You name it, it's being done. And how are the ways that private individuals are being empowered? And how it also overlays, and I'll stop here, but how it also overlays with an entire rubric in the United States where violence is condoned, and even or if it's not condoned, the features by which violence happens are accepted in this country. And I'll just allude to this, and maybe we'll circle back to it. But we've consistently liberalized gun ownership laws, gun carrying laws, self-defense laws. So when we have this kind of new vigilante laws come into place on top of a culture that is already very pro-gun, the odds of things being enforced violently and with the fear of guns being ever present, change the nature of every confrontation that we have in a school library, on an election voting line, even at a high school girls soccer match. When someone starts screaming, "I think that girl is a boy," and starts throwing a fit because they think that there might be a transgender girl should not be on the team because of the sex that child was assigned at birth. And the absolute fear and pervasiveness of guns takes this to a whole different level of intensity.
Of course, in the 60s, we had a tremendous amount of political violence. Some of it might fall into this realm of vigilante violence, but we certainly had a lot of it. And it was kind of this dissenter vigilanteism, to use a phrase that you guys talk about in the book. And in fact, it was successful in some respects.
Yes, so it was successful, but those were not officially condoned in any way. So that is true that we had a movement to powerful political protests that could turn violent, that could turn destructive, but they were not condoned by the state. They were not cheered by the state, and at the time there were no major political figures who were in a legal position to excuse that behavior. Ultimately, prosecutions became difficult, and folks didn't get prosecuted in the way that they conceivably could have. We don't have as much of a tradition, though it's something we can certainly circle back to and really pin down even in the present moment. We don't have a tradition of left vigilantism working in tandem with the state. Like if you think about the 1968 Chicago protests outside of the DNC, they were fighting the police tooth and nail. It looked much more like a January 6th confrontation. I'm not suggesting the politics are same. I'm just saying the imagery is similar. And we don't see the police winking, nodding, and encouraging that type of activity in the past. That could change. There's no question that could change, but our history is complete with right-wing partnerships between citizens and authorities. And so I do hear what you're saying about it enacted change. And if we're just thinking about the change element, there's no reason to think that today's vigilantes aren't already engineering a whole lot of change in ways that could take us a very long time to recover from.
Does the issue itself, the reasons for the vigilantism, make any difference, whether it is pure and simple political or whether it becomes cultural or about race? To what extent does the reason for the vigilantism play a role?
Yeah, I think it plays a role if your ultimate concern, as ours is how does it affect our fragile democracy? Mm-hmm. If the aim is to essentially further destabilize our democracy, weaken contributions by those, particularly those newest to our democracy because the majority has only recently allowed them to participate in public life. That rings differently to us than efforts that are aimed at greater democratic inclusivity. It is a tough line to police, and folks could play gotcha with us over that, and we're okay with that because we're not. Our principal point is not an analytical point. It's a political point, and we think that the claim that the vigilantism, mostly in our past, and that's resurfaced today, is all about reinforcing status hierarchies and status inequalities. So there are legal statutes that authorize victims of housing discrimination, victims of employment discrimination, victims of education discrimination to bring lawsuits, to essentially do snitching, as you referred to it in your opening remark, against schools, against employers, against landlords. And we don't think of those, we think of those as very much analytically analogous in terms of some of the designs. But as a structural matter, one, the likelihood of violence is much, much lower in those cases because those are folks who don't have community power in the same way that could mobilize some kind of political movement. But also, they're seeking just access inequality. They're not seeking to reinforce historical lines of discrimination. And we just have to be honest that America is built on inequality. And we can look at many questions about, is this going to engender more inequality or is it going to engender less inequality? It doesn't mean that anything that engenders less inequality is awesome and anything that engenders more inequality is terrible. But it gives us at least a framework to start thinking about, are these things different, and is it worth it if this is going to engender more inequality? Or is it worth it if this is going to engender more equality? And we do a cost-benefit analysis of those programs. And the bar for, let's say, passing legislation that's going to engender more inequality should be higher. And we're just using those kind of heuristics and applying it into the space of political violence.
When we look at it historically, when we look at periods of extreme vigilantism, are there consistencies in how they came to an end, and anything that we can learn from that?
Yeah, that's a great question. In some ways, it's the question, because if we look, like, how did the Fugitive Slave Act end? How did Jim Crow terrorism end? We spend a lot of time in the last third of our book trying to figure, how are we going to get our way out of this situation? And to be clear, this situation, so I want to step back for just a quick second, Jeff, to actually say, like, what are the stakes here? And as David and I say, all these instances of harassing, attacking, marginalizing pregnant persons, LGBT persons, school kids who want an inclusive education, voters, political participants who are pushed out of the public square by violent mobs. The goal, so in Adam Serwer from The Atlantic talks about the kind of political moment today as like, what is the politics of the American right? And he describes it as the cruelty is the point, that this is all about cruelty. David and I push that further, and we actually say the cruelty is a means to an end. And the end is the maintenance of right-wing political power, particularly in the South. But as we know, that trickles into, federal politics, federal judgeships, everything else. And so it's about extending and further ensconcing right-wing power in America as the demographics, both as a matter of kind of who we are, we're younger, we're more, the greater people of color, and fewer Christian evangelicals, and just our politics are becoming more liberal/progressive. This is a project to keep right-wing politicians and political agendas in place for as long as possible. So that's the stakes. And the question is how can we get past this and have more stable, more fair elections where ideas prevail, and you don't have to worry about, are the folks who vote for me, are they going to be too afraid to go to the voting booth because there's a bunch of guys with AR-15s that are monitoring, quote unquote, monitoring what happens at the polling place. And so how do we dislodge this? How do we kind of get past this? Well, one is, I think we have to look somewhat skeptically at the ability for the federal government to get us out of this situation currently. I mean, the Biden administration, I think, has done, in many respects, a remarkable job given how polarized and American politics is right now, how hostile the courts have been to the American administrative state. But the Justice Department has not been mobilized in the least to help with these issues that are very much civil rights violations and civil rights infractions. So that worries us, but it's not unique. It took a long time before, in the 1960s, the Kennedy Justice Department and then the Lyndon Johnson Justice Department kind of woke up to the terrorism of Jim Crow and really made a push, whereas before that, there were just token signs by, for instance, President Eisenhower. So there's a possibility that the feds come in and kind of restore order. And I think that would be the easiest story. That would be the safest story. And that would be the story that we have the best success with in the past. And that's, again, the kind of turning point in the South, particularly after Freedom Summer in Mississippi, where essentially the country turned its back on the segregationists. I think in some respects it should be easier to do that now. One is we've evolved as a society. Two, more people are being swept up, and more people of different walks of life are being swept up. You could, if you don't care about Southern Black people, you can kind of go about your business in 1960s America, or especially early 1960s America. But now we're talking about, people who want to have abortions in Texas, people who want to, people who have a gay kid in school in the public schools in the South, people who want to read, have books, people who want to vote in Mariposa County in which is Phoenix, Clark County in Las Vegas, Wayne County, which is Detroit, where all these instances of voter intimidation, voter disruptions, election disruptions took place. The coalition of people who can say, all right, enough is enough, is much greater than it has been in the past, where the targets have been much smaller and much easier for other Americans to distance themselves from. All of that should suggest this is easy. All this suggests that corporations who are doing most of their business in the South should say, hey, state legislatures, stop this. But it's not happening, at least yet. And David and I hope that the more attention is brought to this, the more kind of responsible adults in those communities are going to say, okay, enough is enough. This is awful. And even if we don't think it's awful, we think it's embarrassing and it's bad for business or whatever, and to crack down. The other player that was relevant in essentially stopping and helping the American government stop the Jim Crow terror was the international community was chiding us / laughing at us. And I don't think we have, and we were in the middle of a kind of a posturing race with the Soviets at the time. And so the Soviets would say, you're going to join the American coalition. Look how they treat Black people in the South. And that really stung us. Even if we didn't care personally, it stung us because we were afraid we'd lose the Cold War. There is no such coalition in the kind of global citizenry right now to do that, in part because one party in America doesn't care, and in fact would wear it as a badge of honor if the European Union condemned us, or if the Secretary General of the United Nations condemned us, because the Republican Party has defined itself largely as a nativist project that wants to further disengage with the world.
I was going to say, isn't that part of the fundamental problem, though, that unlike situations in the past that were much fringier in terms of where the vigilante activity was coming from, that this time we're looking at it much more institutionalized, and in fact institutionalized in the form of one of our major political parties, makes it much more difficult for the federal government or anybody to do anything about it.
Yeah. Exactly. The politicians who were leading Jim Crow were not going to run for federal office. They were very happy in their little fiefdoms. But the politicians who are leading the charge on vigilantism are the names that we thought would run in 2024 and are likely to run in 2028. It's Greg Abbott, Ron DeSantis, Glenn Youngkin in Virginia. These are all what we would, in any other context, describe as mainstream, politically powerful and elite officials who are well educated, especially in the case of someone like Glenn Youngkin, really cosmopolitan people who have a background in international finance and are doing this stuff. A much different project than the past because the Republican Party is so fundamentally different than it was in the past, because it basically they're pushed out all the kind of mainstream, what we would think of as maybe like country club and internationalist Republicans, and are really left with folks who are seething with cultural grievances.
At the end of the day, do you see this then as something that really can't be stopped until it kind of burns itself out?
Well, that's the fear, and the fear is what's going to be left. How much burning is going to happen before how much is burns out, and I don't see an easy path out. I see this as kind of essentially coextensive with the larger fragmentation and, in some ways, deterioration of the American republic. And so I am quite concerned and quite pessimistic about this and see it as part and parcel of, hey, can we govern? Can we live together for the next 10, 20 years with or without vigilante laws? That particular dynamic is at play, and we see it all the time, and I think we should fear it regularly. In the short term, we think that blue states should actually step up where the feds don't, and the blue states should put more pressure, particularly economic pressure, on red states. And we talk about the specific tools that blue states could use to pressure red states. I'm not 100% certain that blue states want to stick out their neck. If the Merrick Garland Justice Department doesn't want to stick out its neck, and that's essentially their job, why should we expect Gavin Newsom to do so? Or why should we expect Pritzker in Illinois to do so? But that is when you think about, well, who's next up to possibly do it? And the feds may not do it or aren't doing it. Corporations aren't doing it. People aren't reading the news articles, or they're not acting upon the news articles that the media is covering of these instances. Well, maybe states, the blue states, can play a role in stabilizing things. But again, this is our third best solution, because the feds should be the answer.
Jon Michaels. The book is Vigilante Nation: How State-Sponsored Terror Threatens Our Democracy. Jon, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you.